We apologize for the technical hitch that we've just suffered from our initial link, but nevertheless, I'm back. So a very good afternoon to you. My name is Miriam Ogoto, and as I was explaining just earlier, with everything else that has been going on in the continent, the recent conflict and the mediation process in Ethiopia, the ongoing conflict and the mediation process in Democratic Republic of Congo, the chaos in Mali and other places across the continent of Africa, we seem to have forgotten a country that has required our attention here, especially in the continent, from the African Union and the rest of the stakeholders that have been involved in the peace process of South Sudan. And remember the revitalized peace agreement of 2018 that contained about, I think, 8 chapters, and there are key, articles in that revitalized peace agreement that are supposed to have been implemented by now, but a lot of which have not been implemented. And one of them is contained in Chapter 5 of that revitalized peace agreement, and that has to do with the hybrid court. And that was reminded of us last week by Amnesty International, which has criticized the African Union for allegedly abandoning the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan. And it says, since August 2015, when parties to the conflict made a legally binding commitment to form the court, not much has been done to make it a reality. Amnesty International said 7 years later, the court still does not exist, not even on paper. So this was part of an agreement. And I will take us through just quickly through the revitalized peace agreement of 2018, so that we are able to fully understand the context of where Amnesty International is coming from. As far as, remember, this agreement, I think, was a working, I think, I don't want to say a constitution, but this was something that was crafted to set South Sudan in a path of peace, and finally, I think, having the constitution. So it helped, especially in the transitional government. This contained some parameters by which the transitional government is supposed to operate based on. And also some of the things that are supposed to be accomplished as far as moving South Sudan forward is concerned. Remember, South Sudan fell into a conflict 2 years after gaining their independence. They gained independence in 2011. The country plunged into conflict in 2013. So they did not even have time to settle down and try to just build up as a new country. I apologize for that. I'm having troubles with my throat this afternoon, so I apologize for that, really. So Amnesty International said, according to the revitalized peace agreement, a hybrid court, a commission for truth, reconciliation, and healing. So this was part of, remember, so many people died in South Sudan. The whole of this process, and especially after the war broke out in 2013, South Sudanese have continued to suffer. Both sides and all the stakeholders have been accused of sponsoring militia groups and using armed groups and all these actors that have caused untold amounts of suffering, and human rights abuses have been taking place in South Sudan. So there has to be some level of accountability, and Chapter 5, I think, spells out, in the revitalized peace agreement, spells out some of the ways by which some of the accountability, reparations, and all that is supposed to take place. So that was contained in the Chapter 5 of the revitalized peace agreement of 2018 that I think was signed in Addis Ababa there. So anyway, the Amnesty International says the parties to the agreement have consistently failed to meet deadlines to make critical reforms and establish transitional justice bodies without credible justification for the delays. So there has not been any say, and I think we criticize so much the government of South Sudan, and sometimes with good reasons, because this agreement was very, very important. And when you see the manner in which it's being handled by the leadership of South Sudan, first of all, it speaks more to their lack of commitment to see that indeed South Sudan is able to stabilize, and South Sudan is able to rebuild itself, and South Sudan is able to be back to the path of, stability and transition. They're still stuck in the transition government, and these leaders in the transitional government, they don't seem very keen in transiting, in holding elections. As we all know, they keep postponing elections, and now I think elections has been postponed to 2024 in December. They are very keen on maintaining the status quo because it benefits them the way things are. And so implementing something like this that is very vital as far as that agreement is concerned, I think is something that they're not keen to do. And how we know that is because even on paper, they don't even have plans. They've not sat down and considered. So how do we go about this? If we were to set up this hybrid court, what is it supposed to look like? How are we supposed to go about it? And perhaps you're wondering why the hybrid court. Let me just bring us an update of what necessitated the need for the formation of this hybrid court in South Sudan. And this hybrid court for South Sudan is supposed to be an AU-led hybrid court, which will have the mandate to investigate and prosecute individuals bearing the responsibility for the serious crimes committed since 15th of December 2013 in South Sudan, including the deliberate killing of civilians, rape and other sexual violence, forced recruitment of children, forced displacement, among other crimes. Just reading the first two lines tells you why perhaps this hybrid court will be an impossibility in South Sudan, and I'll tell you why. Because it seeks to prosecute individuals bearing the responsibility. And when you look at how the fightings happening in South Sudan, even the recent communal fightings, there are credible reports by the United Nations investigators that say some of these government sponsored. So even a lot of these crimes and a lot of these killings and rapes and sexual violence and other forced recruitment of children, if they were to be investigated, it will take us back to the key players. So because of that, and these key players are the people who were on top of the leadership of the country of South Sudan, so they will find themselves in trouble. I'm not accusing anybody, but we know that we do have the government forces, trained forces now, the unified forces, which was also a key article in the revitalized peace agreement of 2018. It was one of the requirements, which I think on that South Sudan has done well to make sure that they've been able to do that. But on top of just having the military, every leader is said to have their own militia groups, which they use to carry out their dirty jobs. So if we were to set up this AU-led hybrid court, then a lot of these key players and key leaders in South Sudan might find themselves in trouble there. So maybe that is why they're lagging behind. They're not interested, and they will not perhaps set up this hybrid court. And the decision to establish the hybrid court was taken through 2015 peace agreement. They all signed into. So it's not like, it's not like this is something that was forced upon them. They all agreed. And I think this was meant to mirror what we saw happen in Rwanda after the genocide, where there was a court, I can't remember the exact name, where people would come and would speak, the truth, and would say, I killed so-and-so, this is what I did, and they would confess, and others went to jail, others were able to forgive each other. So this was supposed to mirror something of the sort, because it was meant to reconcile as a part of the peace process, as part of the healing process. This court was thought to be important so that South Sudan could really deal with its demons and could really deal with the root problem on and also that would account to I think accountability, because that we know has been lacking so much as far as what we see in South Sudan is concerned. And so so they signed. So this was signed by the government of South Sudan, led by President Salva Kiir, and the South Sudan's Liberation Movement Army in Opposition, that is led by Dr. Riek Machar, who is the first vice president, and they reiterated through the revitalized peace agreement in September 2018. Okay, at the present, there is no other justice avenue available for South Sudanese victims of the conflict, and these what people think could be the only hope. So as much as South Sudan is trying to work out through these other issues that it is dealing with, but they've not paid attention. And according to observers, or according to what Amnesty International here is saying, this court might be the only hope for the general public who have been affected by this unnecessary conflict. This court might be the only reprieve where people can get reparations from the losses they've suffered, from the loved ones that they have lost, from the homes that have been burnt down. Have you seen South Sudanese in the refugee camps? The images from there really heart-wrenching, just to say the least. And so Amnesty International was wondering why. Because African Union was responsible for setting up this court. Why is African Union not taking an active role in making sure that it helps South Sudan in setting up this court? Is it because African Union feels like South Sudan is at the least of its problems? South Sudan even has a problem with paying its membership fee at the African Union, but nevertheless, I think they do have a responsibility as an institution in this continent to see that they are able to keep their part of the bargain. That was the part of the agreement, that they help South Sudan in setting up this accountability court, this hybrid court. And according to all right, Amnesty International, so what they're saying, so if you're not able to set up this court, so what will happen to just the normal South Sudanese who has no any other avenue they can go and seek for help? And days later, in January 20, Amnesty International, let me just take it back a little bit. Amnesty International said in June 2016, Kiir and Machar published a joint op-ed in the New York Times entitled South Sudan, that is in 2016. South Sudan needs truth, not trials. Okay, so obviously they're opposed to the trials. But if you need the truth, then the truth must come with accountability. How are you what will you do with the truth when people come out and confess the things that they did? When people come out and speak their truth, what are we supposed to do with that? So they said, according to this op-ed they wrote in the New York Times in 2016, that what the people of South Sudan need is truth and not trials, calling on the international community to reconsider the hybrid court for South Sudan. So they are not interested. At the beginning of the conversation, when I was just reading through, why the background on why this hybrid court was meant to be set up is to bring people to book. And remember, key players that are part of this government in South Sudan have been mentioned adversely, that have participated, have equipped, have supported these groups that have been causing chaos in South Sudan. So the president and his first vice president say, we don't need this. What you need is the truth, not trial. You wonder, what will they do with the truth? Are they able to handle the truth? Because what we saw in Rwanda was a wholesome process, as much as truth was being told, but also accountability came with it. So if the only thing you want with truth, and then what? What are we supposed to do with that truth, President Salva Kiir and your first Vice President, Riek Machar? But in January 2021, the Council of Ministers approved a plan by the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs. So in 2016, they wrote that op-ed. In 2021, the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs for the establishment of the court and the other transitional justice institutions provided for in the revitalized peace agreement. And they approved, and days later, the AU Commission's chairperson Musa Faki welcomed the approval, noting that it could end the delay in establishing the High Court and other institutions relevant to bring justice and healing in all South Sudanese. However, Amnesty International now says the failure to establish the body reflects a lack of political will to hold those most responsible for serious crimes, which are likely to include senior political and military officials to account, like I said earlier there in my starting statements. And it said the African Union has taken some limited steps toward the creation of the hybrid court for South Sudan. So it looks as if Musa Faki, the AU chairperson, must be acting, according to Amnesty International, in cahoots with these leaders of South Sudan to ensure that they keep dragging their feet as slow as they can as far as implementing this very important aspect of accountability is concerned. And so just a quick run through of what this revitalized peace agreement of 2018 is all about. I think I took my time one afternoon here. We dealt into the details, so we're not going to do that this afternoon. But just a reminder, this was signed in Addis Ababa on 12th day of September 2018, and that's why we refer to it as the revitalized peace agreement of 2008. South Sudan Revitalized Peace Agreement of 2008. Okay, so as I said, it has 8 chapters. And today specifically, we're going to just focus on chapter 5, which is on transitional justice, accountability, reconciliation, and healing. So this is where the hybrid court falls down. So the first chapter was the revitalized transitional government. So right now, as we speak, the government that is led by President Salva Kiir is the transitional government of national unity. And these people have fought. I'm not accusing and I'm not, pointing fingers, but they have fought to keep the status quo as it is with this transitional government of national unity. So South Sudan is basically at a limbo. This was supposed to be just for a couple of years as South Sudan transits now and has election so that the people are able to have an opportunity to elect their own leadership. So the chapter 1 spelled out how the transitional period shall commence 8 months after signing of the agreement, and the term of the office shall be 36 months, preceded by 8 months of pre-transitional period. And then after that, they continued even to give a date where elections could be held. I'll not get into the details. The second chapter was the permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements, which is very important. And that will bring us to another item also I saw just recently on the news about the government of South Sudan saying that they have pulled out of the Rome talks that are being led there by St. Chiriyo. They have been part of it, and part of what these Rome talks were doing was try to speak into chapter 2 of this revitalized peace agreement, which is on permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements. And I think also part of this has to do with the passing out of the unified forces that is part of the security arrangement. So they've been able to meet a very important aspect of that chapter. And then chapter 3, the humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. This is where I don't know if we will ever see happen, because we cannot talk about humanitarian assistance and reconstruction while we still have the level of insecurity that we have been seeing playing out in South Sudan. People are unable to go back to their homes. A lot of them are languishing in refugee camps, not just inside the country, but we see also an influx in Kenya, in Uganda, and other countries across the world. So chapter 3, I think, is still quite fair, because, we must have peace first. There has to be some semblance of peace. There has to be fine, they've worked on the security aspect. Now, these other aspects also must be worked on. And even as much as they've worked on the security aspect, we have seen an increase of insecurity in South Sudan. So it's still a mirage. You wonder, what is the unified forces doing? What is going on as far as the security apparatus in South Sudan is concerned? Are this conflict sponsored so that the country remains in a perennial conflict that cannot have favorable conditions to have an election? Because I know they don't want to have an election. Are they sponsored? What is going on? Okay, so that third chapter, I think, is still far off from the country realizing. And as I said, we will focus just slightly on chapter 5. Chapter 5, but on chapter 4, resource, economic, and financial management. I will not even get into this, but political leaders and stakeholders shall ensure that the transitional government is transparent and accountable. We know that is lacking. It is at this point that the country was supposed to be working on how they can have strong institutions and policies and procedures to fully function for sustainable development. That has failed miserably. South Sudan is the second corrupt country in the world, according to Transparency International, because there are no structures in place that will ensure accountability. These people don't want accountability. They don't want political accountability. They don't want economic accountability, because as if everything remains as is in South Sudan and the chaos continues like they are, and then who has time to ask for accountability from South Sudan? We know they are misusing the money they're getting from the oil proceeds, oil revenues, and other natural resources they can't account for. And so the Chapter 4 just spelled out how they could manage the natural resources and ways in which they could ensure checks and balances and start building strong institutions that will have a structured way where they could build on strong policies and leads towards a path of proper sustainable development. That has failed miserably. And in Chapter 4 now, the one that I'll be highlighting this afternoon is still on transitional justice, accountability, and reconciliation. And part of this, an independent hybrid judicial body to be known as the Hybrid Court for South Sudan was supposed to be set. Okay? They all agreed with this, and they all were signatories to this. So it spelled out how this hybrid court for South Sudan was supposed to be set, and there shall be established an independent hybrid judicial court, the hybrid court for South Sudan. The court shall be established by the East African Union Commission to investigate and, where necessary, prosecute individuals bearing responsibility for violations of international law and or applicable South Sudanese law committed from 15th December 2013 through the end of the transitional period. See, they will not agree. They will not agree to signing to that. They will not agree to implement that part. But they signed. They were parties. They were parties to this, and they signed, and they were supposed to, I think it highlighted a lot of these issues that were supposed to be looked at: the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, genocide and sexual violence, and gender-based violence. All of this are spelled out in this revitalized agreement, Chapter 5. And then the chapter, Chapter 6, I don't know if I can find Chapter 6. But Chapter 6 was to do with the parameters of permanent constitution. Now, they would start working on their permanent constitution, as this revitalized peace agreement was just a transition kind of a handbook constitution to help them through their transition. Remember, what we have right now is a caretaker government, is a transitional government under President Salva Kiir. So under this, they're supposed to work on parameters for South Sudan to have their own constitution. And then Chapter 7 was Joint Monitoring and Valuation Commission was supposed to be set up. I will not go into the details. And then, of course, Chapter 8, Supremacy of this agreement and procedures, and they all appended to that agreement. They all agreed. But now, they are dragging their feet because nobody wants to take responsibility. Because if they were to form this hybrid court, then it will place majority of these leaders, the top army officials and the top politicians in the country, they will be placed at the scene of crime, and that explains why. So, and anyway, they wrote that op-ed. President Salva Kiir and his first vice president, they wrote the op-ed at the New York Times in 2016. So how are we expecting for these two to be the overseers and expect them to form a hybrid court? They can't. So what do? Do we just let the sleeping dogs lie? Do we just continue sweeping things under the rag and assume this many South Sudanese did not die, this many number of women were never raped, this many number of people were never uprooted from their homes, and we move on as if really nothing happened? There has to be some level of accountability. And it is the lack of accountability that we see in South Sudan, that we've seen the leaders continue to operate with some high level of impunity without a care. Because what I'm seeing is, when it comes to things that touch on their own interests, like this hybrid court that will touch on them, that is the time they sing the same chorus and they run quickly together and they protect their own interest. In the meantime, the people continue to suffer. They continue sponsoring this communal violence. As I said, there's a report that came out earlier this year that said there was a communal violence that had erupted, I think was it in Jonglei State or something like that, that credible report said was sponsored by Juba, was sponsored by the government. So these are things that we must look at. These are things that we must, there has to be some good level of accountability. Otherwise, we will not see the end of this. So now, just a couple of days ago, the government said it has suspended its participation in the Rome peace talks indefinitely, citing the non-signatory South Sudan opposition group has been buying time to prepare for war. And as I said, this Rome talks that was being led by Saint Gidio there in Rome, Italy, was actually being overseen by by Pope himself. Remember when the leaders went for a spiritual retreat at the Vatican in 2019, where the Pope was kissing their feet, and we thought perhaps this is the magic, whatever they needed to just make them see some sense on why they need to have peace in their country. But apparently that did not do much to change their attitude towards putting the country first. So the government last week said that it is suspending its participation. It is suspending its participation, and in a letter dated 21st of November addressed to the Secretary General of St. Gidio in Rome, Italy, the government's Minister of Presidential Affairs says the decision was not arrived at lightly. So I'll just quote what part of that letter says. While we have been preparing to engage in serious dialogue with the non-signatory South Sudan opposition group to bring lasting peace to the people of South Sudan, it has come to our attention that this group is using these talks to buy time as they prepare for war. That is what Dr. Barnaba Mariel Benjamin said on behalf of the office of the government of the president of South Sudan. But that group also responded to those claims, and South Sudan Rebel Coalition on Saturday, they did just 2 days ago, downplayed President Salva Kiir's government's decision to withdraw from the peace negotiations brokered by St. Gidio, a Catholic association with ties to the Vatican. In a statement extended to Sudan Tribune, the non-signatory South Sudan opposition group said it was dismayed by the government's move and called on Juba to reverse its decision. So, this that agreement, those Rome peace talks, there are some groups that never signed the revitalized peace agreement of 2018, and that will include the group of Thomas Cirillo and others. But they were part of this peace talks that was being spearheaded by Rome, and so they were. I guess they were actively participating, so they were not very happy with that move of President Salva Kiir and the government to pull out of these talks. And this comes barely a month after political and military leaders of the groups formerly known as South Sudan South Opposition Movement Alliance named themselves as the non-signatories ahead of unannounced Rome peace talks. And Garang Malual, the spokesperson of the South Sudan United Front under Malong Awan, had said that the former SSOMA has now rebranded as non-signatories. They were not party to the 2018 revitalized peace agreement. So that's why they are referring themselves like that. And of course, this meeting, convened by the faith-based groups and Gidio community, brought together Generals Paul Malong, who was not also a signatory of that, and others, Pagan, Mum of the real SPLM, and others. So this is quite interesting. And as I said, this non-signatory side of these peace talks, they've said no, we are still committed to that process that has been ongoing. And so this process started, I think, in 2020. Now, after they'd gone for the spiritual retreat in 2019, so they officially structured and they signed into another agreement in January 2020. in the peace talks in Rome facilitated by this Catholic community, and the opposition groups and the South Sudanese government recommitted to ease hostilities and pursue a dialogue and allow humanitarian aid for the people of South Sudan. So that was the main part of the agreement. The declaration by armed groups in South Sudan and the government of the Republic of South Sudan, they committed that the groups to a ceasefire and continuing dialogue under the auspices of the community of St. Egidio and regional organizations. So this has been an ongoing process and a continuing dialogue. Remember, I think Pope was supposed to be visiting South Sudan in June, but he was not feeling okay, so he was unable to attend. But it was a follow-up of this continuing dialogue. So by South Sudan's government pulling out of this dialogue, I don't know why they will do that. Of course, they're accusing this other group of preparing for war, while I think pretending to be part of those talks. So I don't know if the government has credible information to support these claims, but I think by them getting out of these talks is counterproductive to South Sudan. I think they've made some remarkable steps. Not good enough, but it has been remarkable. So I think this continued peace talks was very necessary, and probably that would have led to a more stable and a more peaceful South Sudan. But when you look at the fact that they don't even want to have elections this soon, they push them to 2024. And even in December 2024, I can almost guarantee there will be no elections. So I think this could be just theatrics, because they really don't want to have this transition. So they will use all means, I think, necessary to ensure that the country is not able to transit. I think that could be what is happening. The government might be having some grounds on what they're saying, but are they credible, substantive, a fact to support what they're saying? Because you committed, President Salva Kiir, you committed in being part of these peace talks and continued dialogue with these other groups in South Sudan. But now for the government to just pull out, I don't know where this will lead the talks. I don't know if Pope has to come back again and kiss their feet. I don't know what would happen now. But of course, this will go, this will really indeed affect and perhaps just pour some cold water in everything that has been accomplished so far. Because these talks are going on, slowly, but they were there. So at least they were there. So by them pulling out, I think it will be counterproductive, and ultimately the people who will suffer are the people of South Sudan. So we were looking at what happened to the African Union's hybrid court that was supposed to have been set up in South Sudan. That was part of the agreement that was appended to by all these parties in the revitalized peace agreement, and that was contained in chapter 5 of that agreement. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody wants to address it, and this was very key as far as accountability of what has been happening and what has happened since the war broke in 2013 is concerned. So you can't heal and you can't have justice, just going back to that op-ed by President Salva Kiir and his first vice president, Dr. Riek Machar. You can't have truth. The way they're saying they just want truth and not trial. You can't have it like that. It does not work like that. For you to have the truth, then perhaps you're working towards healing. And for you to have complete and total healing, then you have to address the matters. There has to be some level of accountability for the people who have been affected in South Sudan to feel like justice has been done. So you can't call for justice and not call for accountability. You can't call for people to heal and love and all these nice, wonderful things that we wish for the people of South Sudan and leave out accountability. There has to be some good level of accountability so that the country can truly reconcile with itself and the people who have been affected can heal. And maybe, just maybe, they can move on. So we shall continue following this story. And I hope that the government of South Sudan reconsiders this move and goes back to those peace talks that have been led by St. Gideon from Rome in Italy, and they work under the Catholic Church, and as I said, the Pope has been overseeing this whole process. I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. This has been Diaspora Dispatches. My name is Miriam Mugutu. Bye-bye for now.